Merci. Je suis désolé, mon français n'est pas bon, so I'm going to talk in English, which is also the language of the Reggia Marina enemy, and this tells you something about that. So, the Italian Navy and the control of naval seas and straits during the Second World War, or as the subtitle says, well, you have the wrong strategy and bad operational capacity. First of all, we have to understand the global strategic outlook in which this naval campaign happened and which were the determinants that influenced it. Fascist foreign policy was directed in a collision course with Western powers during 1920s and 1930s, but it had difficulties in identifying its military enemy. First, Italy think that they had to face France, then an Anglo-French coalition, and ended up in facing Britain and the US during the Second World War. The second problem is the economic needs that this scenario brought up, because before 1934, so before the Ethiopian conflict, you had Italy mainly focused on the necessity of securing access to Suez and the Dardanelles, the two strategic straits of the Eastern Mediterranean, in order to access the oceanic trade lines that will allow Italy to focus on a war on the European mainland. Then, after this changed, because the perspective of a war against the Anglo-French coalitions means that Italy would have been cut off by every trade with the oceans, and so focus shifted on the possibility of accessing this ocean by securing the control eventually of the straits that open the Mediterranean to the wider oceans, in particular Suez and Bab el-Mandeb. So in order to do that, the theory is that you need a naval force capable of projecting your naval power outside the central Mediterranean, eventually threatening Suez from the sea, and eventually interdict the movement of enemy shipping in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. But because we like to complicate our life, things went in a much different way. Why? Because of the peculiar construction of the fascist dictatorship. Fascist Italy was a polycratic system characterized by institutional chaos. You had the military fighting each other for resources without the capacity of defining a proper common strategy. The army still focused itself on a land perspective up to the beginning of the Second World War. The Air Force was obsessed by the doctrine of strategic bombardment, which was never capable of implementing because it lacked the resources. And the Italian Navy went into two different directions. First, it focused on facing France up to the mid-1930s, and then shifted toward a possible war in the central Mediterranean against Britain and France. This was also accompanied by a general scarcity of resources caused by the Italy weak industrial base, plus the problem of technological slowdown. At some point, the Italians decided to build armed forces based on quantity instead of quality, and this, as we will see, would have an effect later in the Second World War. So, with this divergent planning and doctrines, there was a bit of chaos on the nature of the war that Italy was going to face in 1940, when finally the Second World War kicked in the Mediterranean. From these problems derived the structure of the Italian fleet, which in 1940, on paper, it looked quite impressive: fourth navy in the world by number of units, fifth by tonnage. This navy, because it was going to face probably a war against the Anglo-French, decided that the only possible strategy was to deny them the access to the central Mediterranean by closing the Strait of Sicily, the Sicilian Narrows, and eventually by avoiding that the Marine Nationale and the French and the British Mediterranean fleet could merge into a single fighting unit, because this would have led probably to the invasion of Sicily or to a decisive battle that the Italian could not win. So the Italian theory was, we have to defeat the Marine Nationale and the Mediterranean fleet separately in two different main engagements. How to do that? By developing a concept focused on naval attrition. This concept of naval attrition meant that the Italians were going to close the central Mediterranean to enemy fleets, employing air power and submarines to decrease their forces before a decisive battle in the central Mediterranean. Unfortunately, this strategy was, which was called the defensive offensive strategy or defensive offensive posture, because it means that the Italian Navy could shift from a defensive to an offensive posture according to the circumstances. This strategy was plagued by many problems. First, the Italian Navy was backward in technology. Its fighting control system were inferior, rather development was slowing down. Even acoustics, which was not a new technology in the 1930s, was slowing down. This was also combined with a general tactical inefficiency because the fleet had not the possibility to exercise much in the late 1930s because of the budget shortages and the fact that a lot of officers were not in permanent service, but they were recalled, and the same was true for the rest of the personnel. Also, there was no real night fighting capabilities, so they were going to fight a battle of attrition against two superior forces without having a superior tactics and training, like instead, for example, the Japanese had at the beginning of the Second World War. And this mismatch appeared clearly in the early stages of the Second World War. Now, what happened when Italy declared war in June 1940? Luckily for the Italians, and thanks to the Germans, France surrenders, and that means that half of the naval threat that was part of the Italian strategic planning went just out of the problem. So now things were changing in favor of the Italians, because now the Italians had to face only the British in the Mediterranean, and that means that they could go on the offensive, at least in theory, and that's what they did by invading Egypt in September 1940. A bit later, Italy also invaded Greece and tried to launch this what was called the parallel war by Mussolini, an attempt to secure his long desired Mediterranean empire. What was the problem? The problem was that the structure of the fleet did not allow to support offensive operation in the eastern Mediterranean, and it remained focused on the defense of the Sicilian Narrows. A token force was deployed in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb to threaten the British communication there, but was easily wiped out by the British in the next year, thanks to the fact that also submarine forces that they were dispatched there had no proper technology for tropical climate. So the scenario that the Italians were facing at this point was the possibility, according to them, that the Mediterranean fleet was going to launch an offensive into the central Mediterranean. But when this apparently happened with the Battle of Calabria of 9 July 1940, the Italian fleet proved unable to seek that decisive success that was expecting to reach, despite that in that moment they had the most favorable conditions to achieve that. The Mediterranean fleet was close to the Italian coast and therefore in perfect range of the Italian air power. The Italians were able to deploy barrage submarines at the extremities of the Mediterranean to intercept enemy movements, and they had also local superiority in surface ship, but the engagement ended with the battleship Giulio Cesare hit by a lucky shot by the HMS Warspite, and this led the Italian fleet to retire into its base at Taranto. This was followed by another couple of major disasters. One was Taranto, when the British torpedo bombers launched by an aircraft carrier were able to put out of service for a few months 3 of the 6 Italian battleships available in the autumn of 1940, and finally by the Battle of Matapan, which was the only attempt by the Italians to project their forces in a strait outside the central Mediterranean, and in particular in the strait between Crete and the Cyrenaica, in order to assert the control on that area and push eventually the British eastward with their naval projection. All of this ended up in a total failure, and at the end of the 1940s it was already clear that the war was changing, reshifting the focus of the Italian naval warfare around the central Mediterranean, in particular the Sicilian Narrows, and also especially around the convoys that, passing through the Sicilian Narrows and the central Mediterranean, were resupplying Libya to allow the Italians and then the Germans that were coming in their help to invade Egypt. So the strategy that the Italian fleet had designed before the war at this point was essentially failed. If you look at the scenario at the end of 1940, it was close to total defeat. And at the beginning of 1941, when the British had seized Cyrenaica and were already resupplying Malta, that means that their air power could directly attack the Italian sea lanes in the Sicilian Narrows without the possibility of the surface fleet, which was still composed by a huge number of surface forces to shift the situation. This led to the next part of the war, essentially, which was the battle around the Italian traffic in the central Mediterranean straits. Now, as you can see from this map, in reality, most of the Italian traffic during the Second World War was still happening around the peninsula and was necessary for the internal economy. Then the second largest amount of traffic was directed toward North Africa through the Sicilian Narrows. And that's where the main campaign against the Italian convoys happened during the Second World War. One thing that one must bear in mind when we talk about this is that every ship that was sunk in the central Mediterranean or the Sicilian Narrows was a ship that cannot operate in service of the Italian economy, because the reinforcement that should be sent south were subtracted by the total amount that was above. That means that the Sicilian Narrows were sucking up resources that were needed not just for resupplying Libya, but also for nourishing the Italian internal economy and therefore the Italian war effort. This assumed essentially the nature of a long battle of attrition around the Italian convoys, which led to the constant shift also of fortune of both sides in the central Mediterranean. And what were the key factors in this battle of attrition around the Sicilian Narrows and the central Mediterranean? First, intelligence. Ultra allowed the interception of the Axis movement during the Second World War, and in the case of the Italian naval forces, this led to at least 50% of the losses from 1941 to 1943 to being more or less connected to ultra interceptions. Air power and submarines were the decisive element of this campaign. The surface fleet was capable of exercising a passive protection of these convoys, and that means that in reality the massive investment done in naval policy before the war was not entirely useful for the campaign of naval attrition that was fought around the Sicilian Strait. Malta, which remained as an operational base for the British for the entire war of 1940-1943, which was essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the Axis communication. And this had a devastating effect on the Italian sea lanes, because maybe 50% of the Axis losses in the central Mediterranean were connected to the existence of forces based at Malta. Finally, there were the problems connected to the pre-war naval policy. The number of Italian escorts was limited, and they were mostly thought to be escorts for the battle fleet instead of escorts for convoys, which are two different kinds of ships. And finally, the surface preponderance that the Italians maintained during this period could not allow them to stop submarines and air attacks. Despite this, there were shifts in this campaign, as you can see from the different phases that happened during the period between the summer of 1941 and the spring 1942, because first the Italian saw a massive British aeronaval offensive against the forces in the summer-autumn 1941, which led to a major disruption of the supplies that were brought to Rommel in North Africa, and this exercised a decisive effect in not allowing Rommel to build sufficient reserves to proceed in his campaign after the reconquest of Cyrenaica in 1941. Then, the coming into war of Japan, which put pressure on the British in the Indian Ocean, plus the coming back of German Air Force in the spring of 1942, allowed the Italians to suppress Malta, and counting on the fact that the British reinforcements for the Mediterranean were low in a certain period of the war, and this allowed the build-up of forces through the convoys that passed through the Sicilian Narrows that led Rommel to the victories of Gazala and then the invasion of Egypt. But this was a sort of illusion of victory that characterized this war around the convoys in the Mediterranean. Because the victory of Gazala and the invasion of Egypt that led to the Third Battle of El Alamein were immediately followed by a coming back of the British reinforcements, especially of air power and submarines around Malta, and later also in Egypt, that can harass the Italian convoys in the central Mediterranean. So at this point it was clear that the battle of attrition was somewhat going against the Italians. The only hope that the Germans and Italians had was to win this war was to destroy Malta as operational base in the middle of their communication lines. And of course, for the British, was pivotal to resupply the island. And we can see the effects of this logic of attrition around the convoys in the two main operations that happened during this period. The Operation Harpoon Vigorous of June 1942, which was the major Axis success during the Second World War. The convoy directed to Malta was simply stopped. But then there was a major strategic mistake made by the Axis, which was to shift air power in support of Rommel's invasion of Egypt that was happening at that time, instead of launching the long-planned invasion of the island. So Malta continued to operate as the main enemy base to harass the Italian communication in the Sicilian Narrows. And the British invested a lot of resources in resupplying it, as it was clear during the Operation Pedestal, August 1942, in which they scored massive losses on their fleet, but they were able to resupply Malta, and this allowed the decline, essentially, of Italian supplies that happened already during the late summer 1942, early autumn of that year, which in the end was pivotal in diminishing the operational capacity and the tactical capacity of the Italo-German forces in Egypt. So the Sicilian Narrows in the end was at best a disputed space for the entire period of between 1940 and 1942, and in September 1942 it was already clear that the battle of attrition fought by the Italians was already in the losing side. And in the end, we arrived to the last period of this campaign, which was the end game, which started with the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, Operation Torch, which led to the definitive paralysis of the Italian naval war effort. At that point, the situation in the central Mediterranean and even in the Sicilian Narrows was so critical that the surface forces, which until now were based between Taranto, Messina and Napoli, were moved up north to La Spezia because they were vulnerable to the massive air bombardments that could have been done by the American bomber fortresses that were coming into operation in the Mediterranean during this period. And the cost of this operation in the final stages of war was just stunning. For example, the operation to resupply Tunisia between October and May 1943 costed like 250,000 tons of ships, which was like half of the total stock that the Italians had at that time. Indeed, the scenario was defined by the Italian sailors as the Rotta della Morte, the death route, because there was no possibility of success in this area, which was characterized by all the logic of attrition that we have described. So you have minefields, submarine attacks, air attacks, and the surface forces were practically useless in this scenario. And indeed, this led to massive losses of destroyer and torpedo boats that crippled essentially what remained of the Italian capacity to escort the Axis convoys through the central Mediterranean. The proof that at this point the situation was changing extremely fast is in immediately after the fall of Tunisia, in the fact that the island of Pantelleria, which is in the middle of this area, simply surrendered because of enemy air and naval bombardment without even a proper land campaign. And at this point, the fact that the Italian Navy was simply paralyzed by the attrition that it took, was clear also when the invasion of Sicily started, because when the invasion started on 10 July 1943, the massive battle fleet, which was still partially active and well preserved in northern Italy, was unable to intervene in support of the defense of the island, and this in the end facilitated a lot the campaign started by the Anglo-Americans to led to the Italian surrender. So now, a few takeaways from this campaign of what was essentially a large campaign of naval attrition. If we think of wars in narrow seas or straits, it is clear that at least what you can take away from the Mediterranean is that in reality attrition is the key logic that revolves around this type of warfare. And so tactical efficiency is the key to keep up with this kind of battle. And the Italians were quite low in their tactical efficiency. You can see on this chart the number of losses caused by the Italians and the Germans during the entire campaign. And if you look, if there was not the German interventions in terms of air power and submarines, the Italians simply cannot keep up because they were extremely weak on this tactical and operational side of their naval forces. So this is a key element. The second is the capability of sustaining long-term losses in a space like this. if you look at the stats on attrition, it seems that the Italians brought a lot of men and equipment to North Africa, but in reality, looking at the sustainable level of attrition, this was already bypassed in 1941, even more than double in 1942, and was three times over the possible sustainability if you look at the entire campaign. So this war, which was essentially a war of jointness, integration, intelligence, and use of bases, was lost by the Italians because their conception of naval power was still struck in the 1930s, when things were already shifting toward a war that was largely aeronaval and based on intelligence in the 1940s. And this is the key to understand why Italy lost the control of the narrow seas in the central Mediterranean essentially already by the end of 1940. Thank you.